Now, what I'm going to do next is introduce Frank Rulli from one of our partner institutions at University of Zurich. And Frank is going to introduce Randy. So take it away, Frank.
Yes, thanks, Charlie. I hope you can hear me. It's a great pleasure and actually also an honor to introduce Randy. Also, I'm very looking forward to his presentation. I think we all of us have seen the link to his publication, which he will basically discuss today. It's a publication in Motion Researcher called Tachycreationism in Emotion Research. And for those who haven't read the article yet and you still want to keep up, you can obviously follow what Randy will present us in the following minutes. But also you can quickly have a look at the tables and the figures because they summarize quite well the whole point of the paper. It's basically, you know, how a concept of research actually can interfere with the outcome of the research and actually probably also cause wrong conclusions. And I think that these conclusions are extremely important, especially if we talk about emotions, which is something very tricky to approach from an evolutionary biology perspective as well, and something which is most relevant even nowadays, as we all know, in the last few weeks and months. I don't want to go too much further into the paper. We'll certainly hear about the content of the paper and the main perspectives by Randy. I just want to very briefly introduce Randy, which is a bit almost, you know, impossible in a sense that he has such a long CV. You know, I could go on for an hour, but I want to summarize it. And I think we all know Randy too well. He's the father of our field, but still, you know, we have to realize that Randy is actually an MD, is also an evolutionary biologist. He studied at the medical school in the University of Michigan. He also was a professor of psychology and a professor of psychiatry. So that's you know, where the interest with emotions comes from, obviously. And he, in the 1990s, published the famous book together with George Williams. And he's also the founding director and chair in the Center for Evolutionary Medicine in the ASU. And also, you know, the former president of our society. So I think he has all branches of evolutionary medicine globally having influenced by him. So I think it's a great privilege and honor to hear about your latest perspectives on research on emotions, because I think that will be most important for us. And I look forward to all the questions, and I will be the moderator of the questions. So please feel free to either raise your hand or put a chat note, and I will try to see it and try to pass the micro to you. So, but now it's time for Randy to start. Thanks, Randy.
Good. Thanks a bunch, Frank. And a special thanks also to Charlie and Meredith. Isn't it wonderful what they've done for all of us? I mean, here we are kind of isolating, but we can actually talk together. What I have for you today is an opportunity to challenge really a new idea I've been developing. It's really the coming out for this idea with that paper published last week. And I'm sure some of you will disagree in interesting ways. So I look forward to that. I'm going to do a brief set of slides just to review some core things. Also to talk about the fact it's not just emotions we're going to be talking about. It's the challenge is getting it both full screen and on Zoom. We're going to try doing full screen first. There we go. And now, can you make it full screen there, Meredith, or not? No.
I do not see your slides at the moment.
Okay, we're going to go back in a second here. Back to Zoom, back to share screen, back to PowerPoint and share. I'll bet you see them now.
I do, yeah.
And now we're going to see if we can make them play from the start. I think we've done it.
Perfect.
Great. Okay, so again, the theme here is tacit creationism, and that's a phrase I made up to refer to the fact that we tend to think about all kinds of things as if they're machines. And this was really useful when we were fighting vitalism, but now it's not so good. So tacit creationism, viewing the mind-body as if it was designed without reference to any supernatural forces. The whole field of emotions research has been problematic. After practicing psychiatry for about 10 years, trying to help people with anxiety disorders, I decided it was high time I learn about emotions. So I turned to my 1,500-page psychiatry textbook and looked up emotions, and there I found an article. It was 1/2 of 1 page. And I read it, and it said a few general things. So that was interesting. I gave up at that point. And then a few years later, I decided to get into it again. And that was frustrating. And in fact, my frustration with this is a lot of what led me to try to figure out diseases in general from evolutionary points of view. So this has a lot more to do with medicine in general instead of just about emotions. So first, I'm going to try to convince you that fruitless searches in many areas in science indicate schemas that are failing. Second, that emotions research really is spinning its wheels, although it's made a lot of progress in recent decades. Third, that tacit creationism is the main culprit. Fourth, evolutionary views do offer a way forward, but it leads us not to an easy path, but to an unmapped wilderness, which is why I think this hasn't happened a long time ago. Some searches in science just never seem to end. For years, people looked for phlogiston, which was supposed to be the substance that made flammable substances flammable, with not very much success. And then Lavoisier showed that it was just wrong. People searched for the ether, which was supposed to be the substance that was up above the atmosphere, filling the entire universe. Most people thought there was such a thing and couldn't find it. And even now, people talk about an élan vital, or a vital life force that makes life fundamentally different from other things in the universe. So here are some of the perpetual questions that come up about emotions. What is an emotion? You would think that would be settled by now. Which aspect of emotions is primary? Are there a few basic emotions, or are they positions on dimensions? Are they innate, or learned, or constructed, or what? And what's the function of each emotion? The first one, now I'm just going to try to convince you, this is not just me complaining about this. It's, the best minds in the world who've worked on this much longer than I have and much better with more depth. Everybody recognizes that there are complexities here that are not easily resolved, even with lots of great scientific research. The 1981 paper talks about 92 definitions of emotion. Recent books, What is an Emotion? What is emotion? What emotions really are? And I see Paul Griffiths might be with us today. It'd be wonderful if he has a comment later. And the nature of emotion. So what's going on here? You all recall James Lang, the theory that maybe emotions were generated by behavior versus Walter Cannon. Their debate goes way back. Which one of these is primary? A more modern view is this, that they all interfere with each other, interact with each other. Again, this is getting complicated. How many different aspects are there? Debates continue today about whether we should look at emotions as if they're different positions on dimensions. I'm not sure if you can see my pointer. Or if they're a circumplex. I love Robert Plutchik's circumplex, where he tries to put everything together. And so many great minds have tried hard to figure out how we can talk about emotions. And it's a progress. We're much better about talking about emotions than we were before, but it's still confusing. How many basic emotions are there? Here's an article from back in 1990, and notice that to be an emotions expert, what you need to do is posit your own group of primary emotions. Nobody ever agrees about which ones are primary. So I read these books and just a couple hundred other papers. And at the end of a whole year, after I just studied emotions, very hard to think, I got to get a handle on this. If I'm spending my whole career treating emotional disorders, I need to know about normal emotions. How did I feel? Well, I felt frustrated, confused, and hopeless. And I was ready to give up. I did give up for a while. And then I went back to the master, William James. In 1893, says, as far as the scientific psychology of the emotions goes, I may have been surfeited by too much reading of basic works on the subject, but I should as lief read verbal descriptions of the shapes of the rocks on a New Hampshire farm as go through them again. They give nowhere a central point of view or deduction or general principle. They distinguish, reify, and specify an infinitum without ever getting on to another level. If you haven't read William James, go back, gang. I mean, he's just so wonderful. And that was 1893. It was 100 years later. Sadly, we weren't that far past it. We were past it. Big advances such as recognizing that emotions are products of appraisals, that is, a meaning of an event for your personal goals and the like. Profound advances. Good advances in terms of recognizing the extent to which emotions are cross-cultural universals. So I'm not saying that emotions research is useful, far from it. So many smart people have made so much progress, but I think they've been stymied by thinking about emotions as if they're products of a machine. Here's what we've been looking for. Wouldn't that be elegant? All those nice lines and boxes. I mean, that's kind of the model for medicine and genetics and physiology and emotions research. But what happens when you actually look, what you actually see? Jackson Pollock, here we are. It's a mess. You can't, how do you describe that in words? So the theme here is the body is not a machine. It was not designed. It was shaped by natural selection, and that makes it very different. Does it matter? I think it matters a lot, and this interferes with our progress in many areas of science. Machines, plans to find some ideal type. In organisms, they vary. There isn't any ideal type. Machines service envisioned functions the engineer wants. Bodies maximize gene transmission. Machines are manufactured by a process that tries to make them all identical. Bodies, development is stochastic, no matter what, no matter how canalized it is. And the parts of a machine usually have a specific function envisioned by an engineer. Parts of bodies are intermeshed subunits that can't be separated often. Failure of one part is often fatal to a machine. Bodies are far more robust because they're networked, interacting. And finally, the complexity of machines, even the most complicated machines, is fundamentally describable because it has parts and connections. But describing bodies, you have organic complexity that can be nearly, but not quite, impossible to describe. So here are perils of viewing the body as a machine. Basically, it encourages searching for things that do not exist. And I think that's no wonder we can't find specific emotions with specific functions. And the psychiatric diagnosis remains a quagmire after decades of smart people working on it. Brain loci that have specific functions, people keep talking about the function of the hippocampus or the periaqueductal gray. And finally, specific disease genes. At the end of this, I'd especially like to hear people's comments about, modern medical genetics and the search for disease genes as if they're not all interacting in complex ways. A few slides to show you that this is really all of medicine, not just emotions research. Here's the Krebs cycle. Anybody in medicine and biology has memorized it once, twice, 3 times, spat it back, forgotten it, spat it back again. Usually they don't tell you what it's actually all about, which is storing and transferring energy. But that's what we teach people, and you can test people on that. Want to see the reality? That's the reality of the Krebs cycle. What a mess. You can't teach that. You can't memorize that unless you're a super duper biochemist. Whoa. Organic complexity, massive interconnectivity. We all memorize the clotting cascade in medicine, and it's important to know that in order to provide proper guidance for your patients who have clotting disorders. Want to see the reality? That's organic complexity. That's what's really going on with the clotting cascade. And finally, these are all the different kinds of white cells in your body. And notice how they communicate with each other. For instance, interleukin-1 here goes through macrophages and influences B cells. Oh, wait a second. Interleukin-1 also goes from B cells to macrophages. Wait a second. Interleukin-1 also goes from T cells. You getting the picture here? Everything connects with everything. No designer would ever do it this way. This is a product of natural selection, jury-rigging things, and trying to make something that works by minor mutations. It works really well and securely most of the time, but it's damned hard to describe. So I think what we've been hoping to find are Italian gardens. And what we're actually finding when we look at all these kinds of systems is a tangled bank. Tacit creationist view, basic emotions are they're either basic or loci. An evolutionary view of emotions is overlapping suites of responses. Under tacit creationist view, each emotion has its own function. In an evolutionary view, emotions have many functions, and most functions are served by many emotions. Tacit creationist says some aspects are primary, influencing other aspects. An evolutionary view is that all of these aspects of emotions, physiology, facial expression, interact with each other. A tacit creationist view says they're all coordinated and anything else is uncoordinated expression. An evolutionary view, many different aspects can be aroused independently. We shouldn't expect them to go off all at once. And Eiko Fried, I'm not sure if he's in on this conversation, a former student of mine, has done fabulous work on depression, showing that just an overall score for depression misses the boat. Each aspect of depression may have its own separate arousal and function. Same mechanisms for every individual in a tacit and evolutionary view, a proper evolutionary, but actually individuals vary. There's no blueprint in an evolutionary view. And finally, in a tacit creationist view, emotions benefit individuals, if anybody. In an evolutionary view, those damned emotions are always pushing us to do stuff that's good for our genes and often really bad for us. So this is the solution I came to, which is an imaginary phylogeny of emotions. And it points out that there are two kinds of situations in which emotions can be useful. First of all, opportunities leading to positive kinds of emotions, and then threats causing fear of loss and ways to prevent losses, a fundamental distinction between the two kinds of situations that arouse emotions. Notice there aren't any neutral ones. Why? Because neutral emotions neutral situations don't influence fitness. And I'm really delighted that this has been reprinted about 10 times now, various places. It's not right, but the point here is that these are overlapping boughs of the tree. They're not separate kinds of things, but they do have functions, that is, and their functions correspond to situations, not to brain loci or anything like that. And there's no distinct set of basic emotions. Next thing is, what is this emotion's function? That's a common question, and it's the wrong question. Even some really great emotions researchers said the function of anger is, the function of love is. Actually, emotions are useful in situations. Each emotion has a suite of changes that it puts into place to help individuals cope with different situations. Emotions are special suites of changes that improve coping in situations that influence fitness, and in particular in those situations that have recurred over millions of years. But here's the problem, folks. It would be so nice if this all came to some simple path and simple framework where we could say, these are the emotions and how they work. I think it's kind of unsatisfying. For science, we want science to simplify things. This doesn't simplify things, this complicates things. It doesn't provide the simplicity and order that we crave. Second of all, it suggests that organic complexity is really hard to describe, in contrast to our wishes to describe things in simple ways. It doesn't give rise to a great research agenda, so you can say, oh, I want to study evolution and emotions. I'm going to do these 5 projects as a part of my PhD. And we even need to find new search images. And I think our old search image isn't working. That's why the search continues. And we need to figure out new search images. And this is not a job for me or just us. I mean, this is a project for evolutionarily sophisticated emotions researchers over coming years and decades. Here are some projects that I think might be useful. I think it might be possible to trace the phylogeny of emotions by looking back at the different challenges faced by other species. People are already doing this by talking about chimpanzees versus bonobos versus humans versus gorillas. And you can go much further back than that, trying to understand how one emotion evolves into another one, depending on the situations. We can do comparative studies, which is really what I've been talking about. And you can study the costs and benefits of emotion extremes. Some people always get angry, some people never get angry. Each of those individuals has advantages and disadvantages. You can study emotion regulation using signal detection theory. What are the costs and advantages of expressing or not expressing anxiety? That's the smoke detector principle. And there are lots of examples yet to be described of how emotions do not benefit us or our groups, they benefit our genes. And it's very unfortunate, really. There's lots to talk about there. And most important of all for me and others in psychiatry and clinical areas, we finally, I think, can be able to study emotional problems in the context of the normal functions of emotion. That's what the rest of medicine does. If you want to make psychiatry like the rest of medicine, doctors study heart disease in terms of the normal function of the heart. They study kidney disease in terms of normal function of the kidneys. I think we'll make much progress about emotional disorders if we can study it in the context of normal emotions. So you saw the Tangled Bank before. That's an artist rendition. This is a picture I took up at the Arctic Circle a year or so ago. That's a real tangled bank in the real wilderness. And I think that's what we're in for. There's no path through it. There's no demarcations or geography that's easy, but I think that's the reality, and we should try to accept it, much though we might not want to. This kind of organic complexity frustrates our wish for simplicity, but still I'd argue that we need to resist the temptation of passive creationism, because we really need a solid framework for understanding emotional disorders, and if we want to find what's true, I think we need to rely on evolutionary thinking. So lots more about this in my book from last year, Good Feelings for Bad Reasons, and a few websites that might be useful to you. And now I'm going to turn off the screen sharing and turn it back to Frank and Meredith so they can help us have a lively discussion about all of this. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Randy, for this very concise but very diverse introduction. I think it was very helpful to get us into the topic. And, you know, I think we all agree that you mentioned quite a lot of points which are not only relevant for research on emotions, but in general in biology and in medicine. You know, I think still I know too many who think the human body is a machine. But that's a different story. So I would like to you know, open the mic to anybody who wants to raise a question. Maybe just to break a bit the ice, I can start with one which just came up into my mind. You know, we all know that, you know, we are relying now more and more on imaging nowadays. And you know that, for example, in behavioral economics and so on, I think you mentioned the game theory in one aspect of your paper. You know, they try to visualize thinking on an MRI, for example, and try to pinpoint and say, you know, if someone decides something or if someone thinks something, this particular area of the brain is particularly active. Do you think, Randy, that this, you know, and we all know the shortcomings of this kind of neuroimaging, but do you think that influences the way how we deal with emotions if we try to somehow, because this is also some kind of taxonomy which they try to elaborate based on neuroimaging. Do you think that that has an impact on the way how we approach research on emotions?
You know, maybe there's someone who actually does that kind of research in our group who could comment on that. If there is, please raise your hand. How do they raise their hand again, Meredith? Do they just go down to the chat or the participants button?
Yeah, and I already have one hand raised. So.
Just trying to tell people how they do that so they know.
If you'd like to ask a question, you click participants and then there's a raise hand button.
Great, great. So I don't do scanning research, but sure, a lot of my brightest friends do, and they've been excited that they can show great pictures that show different things happen in different parts of the brain in different circumstances, but they've been frustrated because the more they look carefully, the more they think that most things happen in multiple parts of the brain all at once. And just in the last month, there's been concern that the replicability crisis that's throughout science is massively there for interpreting PET and MRI scans, because if you tweak your algorithm slightly, you can make things show up quite a lot differently. I think there's great opportunity. One of the greatest findings I recall is one of looking at disgust. The disgust center in the brain is, of course, it's not a center, but the area of the brain that lights up when you experience disgust turns out to be the same as the center that lights up when you observe someone doing something morally wrong. I think that's very cool. Is it really true? I don't know, but it might be a great example of a primal emotional response getting co-opted by natural selection to help us cope with social situations. Anybody on there who does brain scanning or would like to comment on this one?
I only see actually Joseph raised his hand, but I think that was independent of my question. But you know, Joseph,
Okay.
if you want to say something.
Yeah, I mean, Frank, you know me. I always want to say something. So, for those of you that know me, then you probably are aware that I have been on the executive board of Beacon, which stands for Biocomputational Evolution in Action, for the last 10 years. One of the subjects that's commonly discussed in Beacon is we have because we have a lot of people who work using genetic and evolutionary algorithms, is the issue of that Jay raised in the chat, artificial intelligence. And, you know, his question of whether we could use artificial intelligence to study human emotion, I'm somewhat skeptical of that, because I think anything it would return would probably be artifactual, particularly originating in the concepts of the programmers themselves. But what might be really interesting, I think, is an experiment where you use a genetic or evolutionary algorithm around some sort of, you know, computational template that we could model as emotion and then see where the system goes. And that I think would be really, really cool. And my guess would be that you might not get anything that resembles what evolved in humans, but you might get some kind of system that operates in the context and the environment in which the AI operates. But that's just me.
So that's a really great point, Joe, and it leads several directions. I talked to somebody at a meeting of venture capitalists in Silicon Valley a few months ago, and that person was trying to figure out how to get avatars to express emotions in a way that would induce emotions in people. Because if you can get the avatar to induce emotions in people, you can sell things really well or convince people of political points of view. So this is a billion-dollar opportunity to find ways of using emotions to manipulate emotions, and they are using AI to do it. They're analyzing human facial responses to cameras, just like the ones we're all looking into right now, and trying different things out on you to see if you smile or frown or if your tone of voice changes. I think we will be finding that, you know, these devices, artificial intelligence motivated, will be manipulating us. And Lord help us, between Twitter and Facebook, the entire world is already being manipulated in ways that we can't control or really comprehend. So I think what you're saying is profoundly important.
And I'm going to just respond to that really quickly, Randy. You know, you just scared the hell out of me, because the idea that avatars are going to be used to further institute social control should concern everybody here.
Yeah. Because
again, it's going to come down to what the agenda is of the people who design these avatars. And you start out saying it's going to be $1 billion business. Well, those are the kinds of things that, you know, I hate to say it, you know, George Orwell anticipated without even understanding that, you know, there might be such thing as artificial intelligence someday. And quite frankly, I've been thinking about this problem for some time, and I'm very concerned about the future of even the semblance of democracy in societies when this kind of technology is being deployed so effectively.
Yeah. So I see there's a question from Paul Griffiths. Paul, do you have a microphone? I wonder if they could unmute your microphone so you could expand on your question a little bit. It's a very interesting one there.
Oh, hi, Randy. Yeah, I was just thinking about the concerns that you've raised quite generally about evolutionary design, but there's the issue of why emotions are so unusually hard. I mean, we figured out some really complex systems in the body. So the question is, why hasn't all this work produced something like a consensus abstraction, something like the representations that you showed us from medical textbooks? And that's really what somebody like Plutchik was trying to do. Or, I mean, there are a number of people you could admit that emotions are insanely complex, but still hope to have a kind of core abstraction which omits a lot of detail but preserves you know, enough of the essence, you know, the key steps in the pathway. So I guess the question is how to go beyond the general difficulty of understanding evolutionary systems to ask, you know, is there any hope that we might have something which for the emotions does the job of that representation of the Krebs cycle?
So for those of you who don't know, Paul is a philosopher who has thought very deeply about emotions and written several books about the topic. And I look forward to talking with him this summer in Australia, but the big evolution in medicine course that he had organized there was postponed till next year. Maybe some of you can come next year. But I think your question, I mean, my answer to that is in a chapter in my book about suggesting that information systems, which is what the brain is, really are different than the kinds of physiological systems that are electrical and you know, having physical parts. I think, you know, the brain is an information processing system. As a result, you know, it can get into tangles in ways different from the kinds of tangles that are created in physiological systems that go awry. And even describing the function of information processing systems turns out to be very difficult. You know, you can deconstruct something like Windows 10 and try to look at all that code. But my understanding from people I talk with at Microsoft is that nobody at Microsoft actually knows how Windows 10 works, because by now it's become a product of natural selection. Not natural selection exactly, a kind of guided selection. They put in new modules and it breaks 3 things and fixes 2 things. So they try to fix the things it breaks and make the 2 things work, but it grows and grows and grows. Eventually, you might have to start over because you just don't know how it works anymore. And I think that's my metaphor, Paul, for what we might be dealing with and why it's hard to describe the emotion systems. But maybe it is possible. Maybe if we all really dug in and tried to say, hey, the Krebs cycle is complicated, but we at least can give it a go. Maybe we can do the same thing for emotions research if we were really to give it a try.
And now we have a lot of hands being raised. So I start with the first one, Natalie Dinsdale. You were first. Can you unmute yourself?
Yes, thank you. Hello, everyone. I was wondering if you might want to comment on how mind-body dualism has shaped some of the problems in emotion research.
You know, I used to spend ages on mind-body dualism and read books about it. And finally, I decided not to. I decided that so many smart people had worked on it for so many decades and centuries that, you know, they would have figured it out if there's something to figure out that was clear and crisp. But on the other hand, it keeps coming back. Mm-hmm. And I think it's another one of these questions. I mean, it might be one of these things like phlogiston or ether or emotions where, you know, there's something wrong with the question. That I think our minds are shaped by natural selection to assume that that's a good question. Just like nature, nurture is supposed to be a good question. Our minds just go that way. I think there's something there, but it's not, I don't think, what we've been looking for in terms of trying. But again, I gave up on that and I keep getting dragged back into it. Did you have another thought about that?
Not at the moment. Just kind of, I think you're probably right about what is the right question around that. But there's just so much talk about like emotions and the brain, and like you were saying, you know, with scanning the brain. But when I think about people I interact with who seem to really understand emotions, it would be people who are doing hands-on physical therapeutics with people, like somatic therapists or trauma specialists. And I feel like there must be some way of creating some more integration there. So,
and a really closely related part is our emotions, feelings. And I've resolved that for myself by saying, you know, the subjective experience is one part of emotions. But you can't work as a psychiatrist doing marital therapy for very long without seeing somebody say, I'm not angry at all. You know? And so you can't have, you know, emotion without the subjective experience of the emotion.
Right.
Thanks. So now next question is Paul Watson. He raised his hand.
Hello, everybody. Hi, Randy.
Hi, Paul.
We've had some micro conversations over the years, but I got 2 quick points that I'd like you to comment on. One, is that I think that there may well be functional adaptationist conceptual models that do a good job, and maybe a very surprisingly good job, at describing mental adaptations and their function. And for me, of course, depression is an example. Conceptual models that describe adaptations, and I agree with all the points you've made about emotional complexity. But these adaptations under this conceptual model may play out in very different ways in different people, but the conceptual framework is still valid, and it's too early to abandon the search for these conceptual models that would help one make sense even of the diversity of phenomenon that are associated with a discrete but whole brain mental adaptation. And my second very quick point.
Let me tackle that one first, okay? Because there's quite a lot to say about that one. Okay. After spending that year working on emotions, the big conclusion of my 1990 paper has been that different emotions correspond to situations that shape them. Yeah. That, I think, offers a conceptual frame that helps enormously, especially in the clinic, where you can ask, hey, is the situation present? And if it is present, is the emotion helpful or harmful for the individual? Or is it excessive or deficient and all the rest? So I think that kind of conceptual framework is very helpful. Within that, you can talk about how the emotional state might give us selective advantage. So does that kind of correspond to what you're talking about there?
Well, I think there are conceptual models, say, about what depression is for, to put it in really plain language, which would really guide the kinds of questions that are asked in therapy. My second point was that at the end of your paper, you mentioned the possibility of figuring out what emotions are good for genes versus individuals, and then using various therapies, probably including pharmaceuticals, to get rid of emotions that are just good for genes and not individuals. And given the whole idea that it's such a tangled bank of emotions, it seems like such a intervention could have terrible unintended consequences.
That's an interesting idea. What kind of unintended consequences do you think?
Well, a lot of these emotions that we experience that are good for our genes, we might not like them, but they may be essential for, say, successful social navigation in almost any social setting, cross-culturally.
And falling in love is good for your genes.
Yeah, it's good for me too.
And then, but then sometimes lust overwhelms love, and people know perfectly well that what they're about to do is going to get them in trouble and wreck their marriage and life, and they go do it anyway.
Yeah. Well, I mean, how many years is it going to be before the pharmaceutical companies can, at least for wealthy people, make it so you never have to have a negative experience or any emotional pain in your whole life?
What a profound question, Paul. What a profound question. Yeah, I've really wondered about that.
I mean, it's coming.
Depending on how the brain is designed. My friends in the pharmaceutical companies are confident that they're going to be able to figure that out. I mean, I think organic complexity suggests that any chemical you put in is going to influence so many different neurons and loci and other kind of things that it's going to be like antidepressants. They do kind of everything by blocking the serotonergic system.
Really well, see, that goes right back to my point of the onerous nature of doing anything to favor emotions that are good for individuals and disfavor emotions that are good for genes.
Yeah. Interesting point.
Thank you.
Our next question comes from Brenda Hayworth.
Hello. So just wanted to respond to Paul's idea about why emotions are hard, and I'm wondering if it's about the conceptual frameworks that we use, because they're all going to be limited by the capacity of our mind, which is imperfect and comes up with the best it can at the time, and then we replicate it again and again. So that idea of creationism that is holding us back from the way of thinking, I like moving on from that, but we need to look at both the ideas and the language that we apply, because it's not just the idea that of designing machines is holding us back. Even the language that we use when we talk about you know, how our bodies have evolved genes, or natural selection has evolved bodies with genes to enhance passing on genes, and even that has a bit of a purpose to it. The language is talking about a design that it happens like this in order to do this. But even natural selection doesn't happen with a purpose. It just happens, and there's a result. So I think our minds really need to stretch beyond the old language, the old concepts. And I really like the idea of evolution being the framework that works for that, because I'm a child psychiatrist. I work with feelings, and really it's not going to help me help children or parents if I'm talking about the classifications and the DSM-5. This language is irrelevant. It's about the feelings. It's about very simple language that communicates these things, like smoke detectors. That kind of concept, I think, makes a lot more sense for emotions, and not just specific emotions, but an accumulation of all of them: disappointment, frustration, anxiety, toddlers who feel tired. All of it builds up in an accumulated sense to a level where the smoke detector goes off. So I think perhaps the reason why emotions are so hard, we've managed a lot with the organs of the body, but there's the psychosocial layers, which if we apply the evolutionary idea to the psychosocial layers, we have a much less pure effect of natural selection, and it becomes much more messy and much more complicated. So I think somebody was giving an example about having an affair. Yeah, the drive might mean that then you have more progeny, but it really does a mess to your marriage. So which does a mess to your social standing. So there are so many trade-offs, there are so many complicated factors. But when we start thinking about the language of evolution, we start to lose some of the messy bits that really didn't fit. And maybe what is it, Natalie, you were talking about hands-on therapists. I think the reason probably that they're a bit closer to the mark is that they can't hide behind the words and the cognitive classifications. They're there with somebody, and they have to be tuning into what's going on at a physiological level and at a social level. And if they're not doing that, then they're not a very good therapist, and they're probably not doing that job. So just going back to, is language and concepts part of the problem rather than just the creationism?
So if anybody hasn't seen it, Lisa Feldman Barrett has a wonderful new book out last year about the construction of emotions. And it's not social constructionist, but it's talking about how language and culture and other things change how we talk about emotions, and how talking about them differently makes us experience them differently. Quite a profound advance, I think, in terms of the complexities of emotions being kind of similar in different cultures, but not the same in different cultures. And not just different cultures, but different people. I mean, as a therapist, I talk to people for ages about, are you anxious? And some of my patients say, yeah, I get mad sometimes. And I realize that, people have no idea what you're talking about sometimes when you talk about that. And then when you start talking about envy and jealousy, people have no idea about the difference between sexual jealousy and envy and all the rest. We need to have experiences, and other people say, oh, what you're experiencing is envy, not jealousy. And then you say, oh, what are you talking about? I thought they were the same. So the way we experience our emotions is profoundly influenced by the language we use, the culture we use. And I think psychotherapy has changed our culture, because it makes people pay more attention to emotions and pay more attention to where they come from and how they influence others. But the sad part of all of this is, even understanding from a therapeutic point of view or from an evolutionary point of view, it doesn't allow us to control them all that well. I mean, when you learn how to be a psychotherapist, one of the big things is to not let your countertransference emotions take over and have you react to that person. But you know what? You do it anyway, because we all do have these built-in kind of emotions that take us over. And you know, we're seeing on a national and international scale. I didn't want to bring it up too early, but the entire world has been taken over by powerful emotions in recent weeks. And you know, you can start to try to talk about those things in rational terms, but you're going to get in trouble with your first sentence because it's going to, you know, people don't want to hear about that kind of thing. They want to figure out how can we make the world better one way or another. So on top of all of this, it's also clear to me that natural selection has shaped our emotions and our minds in general, not for accuracy, but for maximizing fitness. And there are all kinds of cognitive distortions that we all struggle with. And in particular, they tend to make us, you know, think things are simpler than they are and come up with theories, and we keep believing our own theories, even in the face of evidence.
Okay, thanks. The next raised question, hand comes from Adam Hunt. Adam?
Thanks, Randy. Thanks, Frank. Randy actually told me about Frank's Institute in Zurich and recommended that I go there, so I'm going to study a PhD there. So thank you for that. I'm looking forward to a career in evolutionary psychiatry, although it does seem, yes, very complicated, as you point out. I quite like that you bring in the complexity of psychology to mix into psychiatry. That's great. My question really was, we're talking about emotions as if they're this separate thing from thoughts and from language and from logic. And it seems like even going further than the complexity that you talk about between emotions, you have this complexity between all of those categories of thinking as well. And if we think about the physical genes, we could, well, it's almost certain that some of the genes affected our language capacity and our capacity to feel sadness, or, you know, you can imagine all this complexity just going to a whole nother level. So I was just wondering what you think the way out of this is. Is it maybe trying to track the gene to the phenotype, or yeah, it's like the line between emotions and everything else in the mind and even the body is just wonderfully complicated, but yeah, challenging.
So Adam, my main response is it's so nice there are people your age ready to go to work on this because I don't think it's going to take a year or 10 people or 100 people. I think this is a project for a lot of smart people over decades to try to figure it out. I think progress is possible. But again, it means accepting that what we have been looking for probably isn't there, and it's going to be hard to describe what is there. But it should be possible to take the different framework and make real progress here.
Right. Great. Thank you.
We are slowly coming towards the end of our time already, but I've seen, I think, Ara Turian, he wanted to ask something.
Yes. One of the questions I have is that if you look at evolutionary biology, the difference between human sapiens and our closest cousins is our ability to integrate our emotions with our thinking. There's a very special place in the brain with combination of others that can do this. And one of the questions I have is, why do we think and talk about emotions as though they have nothing to do with our thinking? In fact, one of the greatest gifts a human being has is he can integrate his emotions with his thinking, and apes can't do that, or if they can, it's very minimal. The other one is that we have the very unpleasant situation that we can flip-flop between being totally emotional or being totally intellectual and not mixing our emotions with our thinking, and become very, very machine-like rather than human beings. So my question really is, isn't there a better way of thinking about emotions when you integrate what we actually do? Even when I'm talking, I'm integrating my emotions with my prosody, with my intonation and so on. I'm not separating it and talking like I was a machine. So one way I think we should go back to think about emotions is that in a human case, what is it that we can do to have those patients who have tough time talking to look at themselves, not only from an emotional point of view, but also trying to integrate their emotions with their thinking so they can be human again.
So it's great. I mean, a lot of therapists have worked hard on that and made progress, I think, in finding individualized ways to deal with it. But I think one thing, you know, I want to make sure that by the end here, this whole thing doesn't come off as really critical of emotion researchers. There's a tendency in human cognition to say, if you're criticizing the paradigm, you're criticizing the people. No, I mean, there's been enormous progress thanks to really smart people working. And one of the real advances is that most emotion researchers do not now see their work as separate from cognition. They see it as integrated systems that interact with each other. There's a fast pathway for emotion responses and a slower pathway, which allows us to see or feel our emotions more and think about them and the like. Lots more work is needed on that point.
We have one chance for a very last quick question. Joseph raised his hand again. Very quick, please. We can't hear you. Joseph, we can't hear you.
I have to unmute myself. Yeah, I just want to make the point, Randy, and maybe I heard you wrong when you were talking about the events of the last few weeks. Certainly, there was a great deal of emotion involved, but I want to make the point that resistance to institutional racism is a rational response against social structures that impair the well-being of individuals. And so, quite frankly, most of the work that I've been doing my entire career, particularly in evolutionary biology, has been to present a rational analysis of racial ideology in our field and in society in general, and how that harms individuals, including those who carry out the racial oppression.
I'm so glad to have this as a final question, Joe, because it gives me an opportunity to, I mean, I've been so impressed that, you know, all of us who think rationally are needed. I mean, it's essential to try to connect all these things. But I often also realize that social movements that actually accomplish something are often profoundly based on passion. And that actually has its own initiative and energy that argument is needed for, but it's interacting and somewhat different and powerful. And I think we should respect its power and try to use it, again, to make the world better. And hopefully not to have other people make the world worse. Wonderful.
Thanks, Randy.
Wonderful way to wrap up.
Thanks, Randy, for these final comments. I think this was a very valuable hour. Actually, I also thank all the people who asked questions or actually contributed on the chat. We could probably go on for another hour because I still see a lot of things happening in the chat, but we want to stick to the timetable. You know, I think we all realize that in these times where I assume the emotions are very subtle sometimes, and you know, we can't really express everything exactly the way we want. Why assume? That's probably why we should interact and leave social distancing behind sooner or later. So it was a pleasure to host and to moderate actually this meeting, and again, especially to have the honor to have Randy with his insights during the last hour. And I actually hand over to Charlie because I have nothing else to say. Charlie, we can't hear you.
I'll just echo your comments, Frank. This was a really fantastic conversation, and I think we only got through about half of the questions. I didn't get to ask my question either, which, you know, I wish I had had a chance. And Randy, I just wanted to say, you know, this figure is one of my favorite in my lectures in evolutionary medicine. I always love introducing this, you know, this image to the students and getting them to think about it. And based on this, I'm going to really emphasize the overlap among these different categories more, which I don't think I've done enough of in the past. But even more importantly, I love this table 2. I think it's table 2 in your paper. And right after I hang up with this Zoom call, I'm going to add this into my lecture to make sure that I can share those perspectives. I think this is a really important perspective for our students to grapple with.
Glad to share the slides with you so you don't have to make it over again if you'd like.
What's that? Sorry.
I'm glad to share the slides with you so you don't have to make it over again if you like.
That'd be great. Anyhow, thank you very much, Randy, for
thanks everybody. Good conversation. Appreciate
great conversation.
so much.
Thank you, Meredith.
Meredith and Charlie for
this. Thank you for Frank. Thank you, Frank, for moderating. I just want to say quickly, we have more Club EvMeds coming up. We have Jenny Tung next week with some of her colleagues talking about social determinants of health. We have Bernie Crespi after that talking about bats and infectious disease. Then we have Barb Natterson-Horowitz with a book club, Club EvMed. Verena Schuneman after that. We have a few other people in the schedule not yet determined on the date, but we have Lou Muglia talking about human reproduction, and some of his colleagues will join in as well. So we have a great lineup almost all the way through July. Keep sending in other suggestions for us, and stay tuned for our next Club EvMed sometime next week. We have the date, I just don't know what it is. Anything else, Meredith?
Nope, that covers it, but I'll just say the next Club EvMed is Monday, and that's going to be at 2 p.m. Eastern time. But I will send out a recording to everyone with this video, the chat, and information about the next Club EvMed.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Hey, everybody.
Thanks for joining.